I love my wife, but she's ill. But you just got...
8 guests Johnny Carson never forgave, and why it cost them everything. For 3 decades, America tucked itself into the soft blue glow of a desk, a mug, and a Midwestern smile. Johnny Carson didn't just host late night. He defined it. He made strangers feel familiar, sharpened headlines into punchlines, and ended millions of days with the lightest touch a television could offer. Viewers thought they knew him, the genial referee of Hollywood's circus, a gentleman with perfect timing and a harmless wink. But that smile lived over a lockbox. Behind the curtain, Carson kept a quiet ledger, unwritten rules about respect, professionalism, and control of the room. Break those rules and you didn't just lose a booking. You lost the room, the platform, and sometimes the arc of a career. He rarely shouted. He didn't fight in hallways or flame people in the trades. He simply closed doors. And in an era when The Tonight Show could make a book a bestseller, a movie a hit, or a comedian a household name, a closed door from Johnny was more than a scheduling choice. It was an eclipse. Not all exiles were created equal. Some were explosions, whiskey and ice cubes flying under studio lights, or a face-to-face threat that turned a joke into a line in the sand. Others were whisper quiet. The phone stopped ringing. We're going in a different direction. The calendar never found room again. The public never saw the ledger change. They only felt the absence. Tonight, we open that lockbox, not to worship grudges, but to understand the code that held late night together. 8 names, 8 fault lines. One question running through all of them. What does a king protect when he protects his kingdom? Before we get there, remember this. Johnny Carson prized 3 things above almost everything else: loyalty, safety, and tone. Betray loyalty, threaten safety, or break the show's tone, and the smile could vanish as quickly as a commercial break. When it returned, you might already be gone. Let's begin where the ledger cuts deepest, with a daughter of the show who became its open wound.
Nevertheless,
Eindruk 1. Joan Rivers. The call that never came. There are apprenticeships, and then there are anointments. Joan Rivers didn't merely do well on The Tonight Show. She became its voice when Carson wasn't there. He didn't just like her act. He entrusted her with his chair, in a business that kept women on cold benches. Carson opened the door, pulled out a seat, and said, on air and off, "She belongs," which is why the break felt less like a career move and more like a funeral. The facts are simple and brutal. A new network, a staggering offer, a time slot pointed like a spotlight directly at the king. And in the middle of those facts stood a single human detail that would matter more than the millions on paper. Johnny found out from the trades, not from Joan, not first. It's easy, decades later, to treat the decision like a chess match between corporations. It wasn't. It was 2 people and a promise. Carson's rule number 1 wasn't written, but everyone who lasted understood it. If I give you the room, you look me in the eye when you leave it. When that didn't happen, when a headline turned a friendship into a communique, Carson's ledger made a soundless entry. He didn't rant, he didn't litigate, he removed her, not only from the couch, but from the story. No mentions, no clips, no warm callbacks to a terrific set last spring. The archive, where comedy lives forever, simply learned to skip her name. In Hollywood, that is a second kind of death. People confuse this part. They think the ban was about competition. Late night has always been competitive. It wasn't the rival show. It was the rupture of trust. Carson's kingdom ran on decorum. He could forgive a bombed segment, an off joke, even a sharp elbow on air. But silence at the moment of goodbye, that was unforgivable. The cost to Rivers was immediate and suffocating. A door that had made her became a wall that contained her. Invitations vanished. Old friends turned careful. And yet, in a twist that belongs to the stubborn heart of show business, she rebuilt stand-up, specials, red carpets, reinventions. She survived the wall. But whenever the subject turned to Johnny, the voice that never flinched on stage would tremble. The ledger hadn't just crossed out a name. It had crossed out a chapter she still loved. There is a lesson here, and it's colder than gossip. In Johnny's world, loyalty wasn't a sentiment. It was a protocol. Break protocol. And the system erases your clearance. 2. Wayne Newton. Not a joke. Most jokes on The Tonight Show go where jokes go. Into the air, into tomorrow's memory, into the collective shrug of a country that wants one last laugh before bed. But every so often, a line is more than a line. It is a label. And in certain eras, one label could dent a life. Wayne Newton lived in a neon time zone with a velvet reputation. He cultivated a controlled image with the obsessiveness of a watchmaker. Tuxedo precise, voice polished. Every step mapped between casino carpet and national television. When monologue ribbing drifted toward innuendo, when the implication wasn't about a haircut or a song choice but about who he was, Newton didn't file a complaint. He got in a car. Here is another Carson rule, and it lives at the spinal cord of every live show. The room is the host's. You do not try to take it. You do not try to seize it with volume, swagger, or threat. If you have an argument, you make it through channels, agents, managers, a call the next morning while everyone's blood is cooler. Newton walked past channels, past protocol, and through a door that most people never even saw. For Johnny, the moment wasn't about a one-liner. It was about a breach of the perimeter. Safety isn't only a bouncer and a red light. It is an understanding. No one storms the cockpit. No fist flew. No camera caught it. But the ledger didn't need film. It needed only the sense that the sanctity of the set had been challenged. The instruction that followed was terse by design. Do not book him again. The punishment may sound old-fashioned until you measure it against the machine. The Tonight Show wasn't simply exposure. It was permission to sell a record, to announce a residency, to remind the coasts you existed past the desert. Remove that permission, and a national career can slowly turn into a regional legend. Newton remained a star where stars never truly set. Las Vegas, but the television artery that fed the rest of the country constricted. In the hush after a confrontation, people like to ask who was right. The ledger asks something else. What keeps the room safe? To Johnny, that answer was stark. There are ways to fight a joke. There are ways not to cross that line, and you don't come back. Bridge. The quiet weapons of a gentle tyrant. By now, the contours of the code are visible. Carson's justice system did not look like justice at all. It looked like scheduling. It avoided headlines precisely because it was most powerful without them. Guests who crossed a line weren't dragged in public. They were simply not there next week, and the week after, and the year after that. No statement, no feud in print, no theatrical reconciliation, just empty air where a name used to be. But the code wasn't only about disloyalty or danger. It was also about tone, the delicate membrane that kept The Tonight Show from becoming the thing Johnny most distrusted: chaos. The next cases don't break with violence or betrayal. They break with vibe, with a sneer that felt too real, a glass that flew, a mind too fogged to meet the moment, a political sermon where a song was supposed to land, a carnival barker mistaking conversation for a fight. 3. Charles Grodin, the comedy that felt too real. Some experiments begin as delightful accidents. Charles Grodin's first appearance on The Tonight Show looked like just that, an experiment that worked. Instead of polished anecdotes, Grodin leaned into discomfort, sparring with Johnny as though the host were an adversary. The result was a brand of comedy that blurred the line between act and argument, drawing laughs from the audience precisely because it seemed dangerous. Carson, a master of timing, recognized the bit and played along. For a moment, it was alchemy. But experiments require control, and control was Johnny's religion. As Grodin returned again and again, his persona sharpened. The interruptions grew bolder. The dismissive tone edged closer to insult. What once looked like parody began to feel like exposure. He accused Johnny of coasting, suggested his questions were lazy, mocked his detachment. To the audience, it played like bold satire. To Johnny, it scraped the surface of his greatest insecurity, that his warmth on camera was a performance, not a truth. Here is the subtlety. Carson adored comedy, even sharp barbs. But he refused to allow the very premise of The Tonight Show, the host as trusted anchor, to be punctured. Grodin's act risked convincing millions that Carson wasn't genuinely listening, wasn't genuinely invested. For a man already haunted by private distance and failed marriages, the insinuation cut too deep. The ban wasn't theatrical. No memo was posted. No feud leaked to Variety. It was 4 quiet words whispered after a segment ended. We're done with that. And with that, a guest who once had a standing invitation was suddenly absent forever. Grodin would later admit he might have overplayed the act, likening it to Andy Kaufman gone too far. But the truth is simpler. Johnny could not abide anything that blurred the trust between host and audience. When the mask threatened to become the truth, the ledger snapped shut. 4. Shelley Winters, The Whiskey Glass. Shelley Winters carried 2 Oscars and an aura of volatility into every room she entered. Brilliant, magnetic, but mercurial. She could turn a story into electricity or a dinner into chaos. For a while, Carson managed the gamble. She was a storyteller with decades of Hollywood history in her pocket. And when she was on, she was dazzling. But by the mid-1970s, her entrances grew unpredictable, her drinking harder to ignore. The breaking point came on a night that would become legend in the hallways of NBC. Winters sat in the guest chair, slurring her way through half-formed anecdotes. Johnny, ever the professional, tried to keep the ship steady. Then came a small joke, a light comment about her weight, one she had laughed at in the past. This time, the response wasn't laughter. It was a glass of whiskey, hurled straight into Johnny Carson's face under the studio lights. The gasp from the audience was visceral. Carson's face, dripping and frozen, told the rest of the story. He called for a commercial break, walked off set without a word, and returned only after changing suits. Shelley Winters was escorted out of the building and never invited back. For Carson, it was never just about the drink. It was about the contract, an unspoken covenant of respect between host and guest. The show was sacred space. To humiliate the host publicly was to violate the very foundation of that space. The ledger wrote her out with permanent ink. The consequences were severe. At a time when The Tonight Show was the beating heart of publicity, Winters lost her access to millions of living rooms, already aging in an industry that punishes women for time. The ban accelerated her drift to the margins. Winters herself, in later interviews, admitted Johnny had every right. "I was in a bad place then. He never wanted to see me again, and I couldn't blame him." For Carson, the lesson was eternal. You can stumble, you can ramble, but you cannot turn the show into a spectacle at the host's expense. That line, once crossed, meant exile. 5. Rich Little, the voice that wouldn't stop. No guest seemed safer than Rich Little. For over a decade, his impressions filled The Tonight Show with laughter. Politicians, movie stars, even Johnny himself. He was the kind of performer audiences loved to see return, a dependable hit. 30 appearances cemented him as almost part of the furniture. And then he disappeared. No public spat, no drink thrown, no headline betrayal, just silence. The invitations stopped coming, and one of Carson's most reliable guests was gone for years. Viewers speculated. The truth emerged slowly, in whispers from staffers and later in Rich's own reflections. The issue wasn't talent, it was tone. Off camera. Rich Little never stopped. He stayed in character between segments, in the hallways, even during commercial breaks. What thrilled an audience for 10 minutes exhausted Johnny for hours. Carson, who valued authenticity in private, bristled at what he perceived as a relentless mask. "Does he even have his own voice?" he once muttered. A line laced with irritation, not humor. Worse, Johnny began noticing repetition. With his photographic memory for comedy bits, Carson realized Rich was recycling material, repeating impressions, tweaking old routines. For Johnny, who demanded freshness from every guest, this was a cardinal sin. To him, The Tonight Show wasn't just about entertainment. It was about trust in quality. If a guest coasted, it reflected on the host's judgment. So the ledger closed. No big scene, no confrontation. Just the quiet removal of a name from the call sheet. When Rich's publicists asked, they were told the schedule was full or the show was going in a different direction. That direction never came back around. Rich Little later said he wished he had been told. "I could have built all new material," he reflected. But in Carson's world, explanations were luxuries. The absence itself was the message. The Rich Little case reveals a different kind of exile. Not dramatic, but terminal. To Johnny, predictability was its own form of betrayal. 6. Truman Capote, the collapse in real time. He was one of America's most celebrated voices, razor sharp, wickedly funny, and a natural guest in the early years of talk television. Truman Capote had turned novels into cultural landmarks and himself into a personality audiences adored. Breakfast at Tiffany's, in cold blood. He had the pedigree, the wit, the sparkle, but genius can't outpace gravity forever. By the mid-1970s, Capote's dependence on alcohol and pills was no longer a rumor. It was visible. When he walked onto Carson's stage in 1975, the transformation was brutal. His steps were unsteady, his eyes glassy, his speech slurred. Johnny tried. He asked short, guiding questions. He leaned into humor, into the rhythm he could usually use to rescue a faltering guest. But Truman wasn't just struggling, he was incoherent. Anecdotes unraveled into half-words. Gossipy asides turned explicit, and the audience watched in uneasy silence. For Carson, who protected his audience as fiercely as his own reputation, this wasn't quirky, it was disrespect. The interview, scheduled for 10 minutes, lasted barely 4. During the commercial break, Carson leaned in and said softly, "You're not well tonight. We're going to cut this short." Capote protested, but his words betrayed the truth of Carson's judgment. When the show returned, Johnny ended it with brisk courtesy. Truman was never booked again. The consequences were devastating. The Tonight Show was the literary megaphone of the age. Losing it meant losing millions of readers. His last major work, Music for Chameleons, received far less attention without Carson's couch as a launchpad. For an author already in decline, the loss was catastrophic. Carson's code was unyielding here. Private demons were your own, but you did not bring them into America's living room. That boundary was non-negotiable. Capote had crossed it, and the ledger closed. 7. The Smothers Brothers. Comedy with a megaphone. Tom and Dick Smothers were never just comedians. They were symbols. Their CBS variety show had been canceled for daring to poke at the Vietnam War, their political satire turning punchlines into protest. To half the country, they were heroes. To the other half, agitators. Carson liked them, at first. They were funny, sharp, musical. But Johnny's philosophy of late night was clear. The show was a refuge, not a battleground. He joked about politics, but never picked sides. The Smothers Brothers lived on the opposite principle. Comedy as weapon, laughter as resistance. The breaking point came in 1970, when Tom used his segment on The Tonight Show to deliver what amounted to an anti-war speech. It wasn't in the pre-interview notes. It wasn't part of the expected banter. Carson's face held the smile, but his eyes told another story. Cold, disengaged, furious at being ambushed. After the taping, his verdict was simple. Too much trouble for what we get. From that moment, the brothers entered what staffers called Carson Purgatory. They weren't officially banned, but they were never truly welcome again. Invitations slowed to a trickle, each appearance conditional on one rule: no politics. For Tom and Dick, that condition cut at the core of their identity. They wanted the platform, but not the gag order. The result was a long, slow exile. Occasionally they appeared, but never with the freedom they craved. The Smothers Brothers case reveals the third pillar of Carson's code. The Tonight Show was entertainment, not activism. Guests who forgot that found themselves quietly erased. 8. Morton Downey Jr. The circus at the door. By the late 1980s, a new breed of talk host had emerged. Loud, combative, gleefully confrontational. Morton Downey Jr. was its poster child. On his own show, he screamed at guests, blew cigarette smoke in their faces, and whipped audiences into frenzy. For Johnny Carson, it was everything he despised. When Downey came on The Tonight Show in 1988, the tension was visible from the start. Instead of sitting, he prowled the stage, playing to the audience like it was his circus. Carson's jaw tightened. He tried every trick: humor, direct questions, even polite challenges. But Downey wasn't there to converse. He was there to dominate. The breaking point came when Downey mocked other talk hosts for lacking courage, an unsubtle jab at Carson himself. Johnny's smile stayed fixed, but the decision was already made. He wrapped the segment early, thanked Downey with icy formality, and backstage gave his verdict. That's not television. That's a circus act. And this isn't the big top. Downey was never invited back. The ban wasn't personal so much as philosophical. Carson wasn't just rejecting a man. He was rejecting a future he wanted no part of. Shock TV was rising. Johnny's Tonight Show would die on its own terms, never surrendering its civility to chaos. 8 names, 8 different transgressions: betrayal, threat, insult, chaos, intoxication, politics, repetition, spectacle. Each of them met the same end: exile. The lesson isn't about grudges, it's about boundaries. Carson's smile was America's nightlight, but it was also armor. He protected the tone of his kingdom with quiet ruthlessness. No raised voices, no public feuds. Just a ledger that marked you gone. Some recovered. Joan Rivers built an empire. Rich Little found stages elsewhere. Others never fully returned. Truman Capote's career withered. Shelley Winters lost the audience that might have rediscovered her. Morton Downey Jr.'s flame burned hot and died quickly. Johnny Carson left television in 1992 as the undisputed king of late night. His standards, loyalty, safety, tone, remain etched in the DNA of every host who followed. Even in an era of louder, harsher TV, the memory of Carson's ledger lingers as a reminder. The smile was generous, but it was never unconditional.